Hey everyone, welcome back to the YouTube channel. My name is Furkhan Dandia and I'm a therapist, but I'm also a father. And today I'm going to talk about something that is very taboo and has become quite the issue with respect to the legal system, and that is the word alienation, specifically parental alienation. Now, I want to talk about some of the underlying issues with respect to this phenomenon or challenge, as we would like to look at it from a legal perspective, but also get into the impact it has on specifically the children involved. The way I look at it as a father myself who's been affected by this, I'm an adult. I can figure it out. It is frustrating. I can seek help. I can express myself. I can work through this. But at the end of the day, people that suffer the most are the children, who often can feel neglected, and it can also impact their self-esteem. And I will talk about some of that. There's research that supports these findings. It is an issue that affects countless families worldwide. It creates pain, confusion, and as parents who are on the receiving end, it can create a sense of hopelessness. Now, today I want to share some insights and offer some strategies, and most important, remind you that you're not alone in this journey, especially if you're watching this and have been affected. What is parental alienation? It occurs when one parent deliberately tries to undermine the child's relationship with the other parent. Now, sometimes it can happen on an unconscious level as well. However, this can manifest in many ways. It can show up as bad mouthing, blocking communication, or manipulating the child's perception. Now, over time, unfortunately, this creates a wedge between the child and the targeted parent, and often that can lead to estrangement. I just want to be clear, this isn't really about one parent winning and the other losing. As I've highlighted before, unfortunately, at the end of the day, the person that's getting affected the most is the child, or if there's multiple children involved. And they're impacted because they're robbed of a healthy relationship with both parents. Now, studies have shown that children in these situations can experience long-term emotional and psychological challenges, which can include trust issues, identity struggles, and difficulty forming relationships in adulthood. I'll get into that research, at least one of the papers I've come across, and expand on that. Let's maybe talk about that research piece. The paper here I'm referring to is from the Journal of Divorce and Remarriage, and it's titled "To Turn a Child Against a Parent is to Turn a Child Against Himself: The Direct and Indirect Effects of Exposure to Parental Alienation Strategies on Self-Esteem and Being." This paper is authored by Amy Baker and Naomi. So I will put that in the description. So there's a few things I want to touch on. The research here was based on, I always like to talk about sample size, and because it's important, right? If we have a small sample size, it's hard to say conclusively that this is a theme, right? So in this case, they conducted their research with 118 adult children of divorce, and they were examined via confidential and anonymous computer surveys. And what they found was there was exposure to 19 parental alienation strategies. Parents who exhibit parental alienation strategies, this is from the paper here, it can be considered to be psychologically maltreating the child because the expression of the strategies inevitably and directly result in the child feeling worthlessness. They feel flawed, they feel unloved, they feel unwanted, endangered, or only of value in meeting another's needs. Often that does go below the surface. We don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to the significant impact it's having because, again, the legal system is not really structured to get into some of these details of the long-term effects. Often the focus is on what's happening in the short term or immediately in front of us, and you can't really get to the bottom of some of these strategies and the long-term implications. Parents who exhibit parental alienation strategies are also likely to behave in other ways that can result in the child feeling psychologically maltreated, lack of empathy, and inability to tolerate the child's separate needs and perceptions. Those are some things that come up. Now, what are some of the strategies that take place and do impact the self-esteem of the child? I want to just go over them briefly. So the first, as I've highlighted previously, is the essence of the bad-mouthing message, and it's that the targeted parent does not love the child. So that's the underlying message that's taking place there. And then the child, unfortunately, extrapolates that into that I'm not lovable. You can see how that can impact a young individual's self-esteem. As we know now through brain research that an individual's brain doesn't develop well into their 20s. For girls, it's a bit earlier in their 20s, but for males, it's around the ages of 25 to 30. So if you're in the adolescent ages or even younger than that, you don't know how to understand this. You're not able to express yourself. You're not able to make sense of it. You're taking what you're being told at face value. And obviously that can have significant impact. The second way in which parental alienation strategies can impact a child's self-esteem is through the child's internalization of the negative message about the targeted parent. So the child is saying, okay, this parent of mine is flawed, so then I must be flawed or damaged. So if that parent is no good, then maybe I'm also no good because I'm a part of them, right? So that again can have other implications, and you can see why that can impact the child's self-esteem as well. The third way in which exposure to parental alienation strategies can be associated with self-esteem problems is the parent who exhibits these behaviors is conveying to the child intentionally or unintentionally that his or her love for the child is contingent of the child's acceptance of the bad-mouthing message. The child feels if I'm going to take part in this bad-mouthing or turning against my other parent, I'm going to feel acceptance from my parent who's exhibiting the parental alienation strategies. Again, because it's hard to know what's going on in the mind, and it can vary from child to child, but at the end of the day, if you feel like, okay, if I can get acceptance here, then I don't need to seek it elsewhere. So not able to make sense of it. If this parent is bad, then I need acceptance from the other parent. So again, the child experiences that the alienating parent hates the targeted parent more than the parent loves him or her. And that can often be internalized for the child as I'm not lovable. The fourth way is reflected in the excessive dependency cultivated between the alienating parent and the child. The researchers talk about here is the alienating parents use many of the same thought reform and emotional manipulation techniques that cult leaders will use to undermine the critical thinking skills of members and indoctrinate them into a cult. So we see this quite a bit, even in how people are able to recruit children or younger adults into gangs. It's by feeding on that need of every individual to be seen, heard, and understood, the sense of belonging that we all want. But when someone is extremely vulnerable, like a child, it's easy to feed on that, right? So then using those strategies, the child then feels like he or she belongs. And that only occurs if I'm able to turn against this targeted parent as well. So what they're talking about here is the child is exposed to alienation strategies and then encouraged to believe that the alienating parent knows the child's thoughts, feelings, and needs better than the child himself or herself. And then the child is encouraged to rely exclusively on the opinions and guidance from that parent in such a way as to reduce the child's trust and respect in others, including himself or herself. So again, this is from the paper here. When the researchers interviewed the research participants, what they found was these individuals were struggling with becoming self-sufficient. They were floundering as young adults and beyond, and not quite making their way into the world. So one of the things I've recognized in the therapy world is this sense of differentiation and being able to build resiliency when you go out into the real world. So if you're not able to differentiate yourself as an individual, if your identity is tied to one of your parents or caretakers, or if you haven't really had any exposure to difficult situations and be able to build that resilient muscle, you're often going to experience difficulty as you go out into the real world. And that's where a lot of anxiety and depression can come in. So that's essentially what they're trying to highlight here. What they found was this parental alienation can directly and negatively influence long-term self-sufficiency. And then the underlying logic is that parents who enforce a worldview on a child do not want that child to think for themselves. So that's where a lot of the challenges can come up as the child grows up into an adult and goes out into the real world. A lot of the times what's happening is the child cannot question assumptions about the targeted parent, and then unraveling of the alienation efforts. Alienating parents are likely to reinforce compliance, obedience, and adherence to their worldview rather than promote independent thinking and self-determination, which are necessary skills for adult functioning. So that's something Dan Siegel talks about, and they've referenced that in this paper as well. Those are the main things, again, just to highlight that. And then the paper also talks about some long-term impacts as well. There can be indirect effect on depression, alcohol abuse, and attachment because of the reduced self-esteem. And then low self-esteem is associated with subsequent depression in light of the negative beliefs that the child internalizes about himself or herself through the alienation process. Again, this low self-esteem might drive the child to constantly and negatively compare himself or herself to other people, which can often also manifest as depression. It can also drive the child to rely excessively on the alienating parent for guidance and approval. That's something I talked about as well, and that's that whole cult and gang member phenomenon coming into play here as well. And then the last piece here is the self-medication model of addiction proposes that substance abusers utilize drugs or alcohol as a method of coping with painful addictive affective states. So the other piece here to touch on is the fear of abandonment, right? That can have maladaptive interpersonal dependency, specifically neediness, and codependence. These are all consequences that we often don't highlight or think about. And then the self-medication model of addiction proposes that substance abusers utilize drugs or alcohol as a method of coping with painful affective states, such as self-hatred and low self-esteem. So again, a lot of these underlying issues can then have other consequences that we don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to. I've talked about the strategies and the long-term implications. Now, what can we do? So if you know someone or yourself who's experienced parental alienation, how frustrating the legal system can be, the court battles can drag on for years. I know this personally, and if you don't have the financial means to do it, then that can be another barrier. So at those times, it can also feel like the system is more bureaucratic than focused on the well-being of the child for all the reasons I've highlighted, why the well-being of the child is important. So this lack of enforceable accountability for alienating behavior can often leave the targeted parent feeling helpless. What can we do? At the end of the day, as tough as it is, there is a way forward. So even in the darkest times, we can find light. As the parent on the receiving end, it's important to keep these things in mind. Prioritizing one's mental health, seeking therapy, joining support groups, especially with parents who are dealing with similar issues. Sharing your story and hearing others can often feel validating. Again, it may not solve the problem, but it does help. Be a role model. Regardless of the circumstances, strive to show up as a consistent, loving, and supportive presence in your child's life. They will ultimately remember your efforts, even if it takes time. They have that memory, right? And at the end of the day, by showing up, you're also setting an example for the child when they're ready to take that step. Don't engage in the toxic games. It can be tempting to respond to the other parent's actions with anger or retaliation, but it reinforces the negative narrative. And then if the other person is vengeful or bitter or they're getting a kick out of this, you're feeding into that satisfaction. And if you hold yourself to higher standards and higher values, you're compromising on those. So always keep that at the forefront. Maintain your dignity and composure. This is a long game. As hard as it may seem in the moment, you have to think about short-term pleasure over long-term gratification. And then document everything. Keep record of interactions, court orders, and any instances of alienating behavior, especially if you're trying to navigate the legal system, as frustrating as it can be. At the end of the day, and I say this with fully understanding the pain that comes with this, being in it myself, that you have to believe in yourself. That's what will get you through. Believe in the process. Trust your love for your child. That will get you further ahead more than anything else. Because if you truly believe in your love, in yourself, you can navigate this situation. And at times it will get tough. I experience that on a regular basis where I just feel hopeless and defeated. But I know in the long term, this is not only a process of growth for me, but it's also a test that will allow me to show up as a better individual if I'm able to navigate this and grow through this and not let it defeat me. And defeat doesn't mean that I have to give up, but it also means that I'm not giving into the games that are being played. At the end of the day, the truth is what sets us free. And I truly believe in that. And I hope you can as well as you navigate this situation. If you have any questions, if you would need someone to chat to, I'm available. Please feel free to contact me. But if you know someone that is struggling with this or yourself, please subscribe or share. And I hope that together we can all get through this difficult situation as we